Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce the following session titled Built on the Rock, Communicating Text Through Music. This session will be presented by Dr. Elizabeth Grimpo, who is a music professor here at Concordia University, Nebraska, and she also teaches music at Trinity Academy here at Concordia University. Please welcome with me Dr. Grimpo.
Good afternoon. This presentation will discuss music's ability to communicate by using its elements, namely rhythm, melody, harmony, form, texture, and timbre in a purposeful way. Then, specific attention will be given to the sturdy and bold hymn Built on the Rock and a contemporary piano composition based on it. A bit of background information. The organ is rightly considered the king of instruments. It has sounds and colors that far exceed any other single instrument, and its power and size are unmatched. The piano is sometimes considered the queen of instruments. Though its power and size pales to that of the organ, it has a beautiful palette of sounds and colors, created not through stops and pipes, but through articulations, touch, and nuance. I know how to play the organ, but I consider myself a pianist. It's the instrument I love more. And at this point, I need to admit my jealousy of organists. I know a lot of them, they are my friends, but I'm jealous of them because their repertoire is full of pieces based on hymn tunes. Hymns that I hold very dear, hymns whose texts and tunes I've known since I was little. What a wonderful treasure they have. That's not the case for pianists. We simply don't have much hymn-based music in our serious repertoire. Last summer, I commissioned John Kosch, a composer based in Lincoln, Nebraska, and the composition instructor here at Concordia, to write a piano piece based on the hymn Built on the Rock. I could have chosen 100 different tunes, but I chose this one, partly because it isn't necessarily tied to a specific season of the church year, and partly because I thought it had the potential for a lot of creativity. I asked John to make it fairly advanced and around 5 minutes in length. That's it. The exciting and slightly nerve-wracking thing about commissioning a work is that you never know what you'll get. The parameters were set, but the details and the individual artistry was completely unknown. And I think that's the beauty of creativity in any field. Needless to say, I was very happy with the final product. John provides program notes on the title page of the score. They begin this way. He says, "This arrangement of Built on the Rock is an evocative tone poem, vividly illustrating the content of the hymn text." Before we get to the piece itself, which is the focus of this presentation, it's important to take a brief glance at music history, especially as it relates to the term tone poem. What is a tone poem? Well, a tone poem may be described as a type of program music. What is program music? Program music is a very broad designation originating in the 19th century for any piece of instrumental music that is meant to convey a specific story, poem, idea, or scenery. Often, composers of program music would give their pieces and movements within these pieces descriptive titles or include short program notes so the listener would know exactly what the composer intended to convey. A tone poem, then, is a category within program music. The tone poem, or symphonic poem, those two terms are interchangeable, tone poem, symphonic poem, was developed by Franz Liszt, considered one of the greatest pianists of all time, in the middle of the 19th century, but he was also a composer and wrote a lot of orchestral works. And he also coined the term tone poem. It is simply a piece for orchestra, typically in a single movement, meant to communicate something non-musical. A helpful description of a tone poem that I recently found on a classical music blog is this, and I quote, "What all tone poems have in common is an effort to describe musically a particular mood or event in a manner that uses the orchestra as a giant paintbox." End quote. In the case of the Built on the Rock tone poem for the piano, which I'll discuss in detail. John Kosch, the composer, uses the piano as a giant boombox. But before we turn our attention to that, let's take a look at some examples of program music throughout history to see what it is that makes them work so effectively. And feel free to sit wherever you want. And it's weird because the doors are in the front door, so move around as you need. The Moldau, a very popular orchestral work written by the Czech composer Radek Smetana in 1874, is the second movement of his orchestral suite, which he titled My Homeland. Each movement within the suite is a self-standing symphonic poem or tone poem describing something different. The Moldau describes a river in Europe, which begins as two little tributaries, one warm and one a little cooler. Smetana communicates this at the very beginning of the tone poem through the melody, one of the elements of music, with a sextuplet figure that moves by step, followed by two disjunct eighth notes, and it sounds a little bit like this. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-dum, bum, ba-da-da-da-da-da-dum, bum. This melodic motive, played by the flutes at a muted dynamic level and in a lower part of the register, is repeated and varied, providing the listener with the imagery of two tiny streams of swirling water. And you can kind of see that as I was singing that pattern. It really does communicate the idea of a swirling stream. This material continues for about a minute until the two tributaries finally meet and join into one. And you can hear that exact moment in music when they meet because it's very clearly communicated. How? By the addition of a bass line, by the string family joining the woodwinds in that swirling motivic pattern, and by a main melody finally entering. So let's listen to a little bit of the opening of the Moldau. As the work continues, the river flows through the European countryside past grand forests where we hear a horn line announcing the hunt through soaring arpeggios, dotted rhythms, and consonant chords. Consonant chords are chords that we would consider stable and pleasing. And the river keeps flowing and passes a folk dance. Here, we hear music that imitates a rustic dance through rhythmic patterns typically associated with polkas, and a folk-like melody, which is simple, tuneful, and utilizes a narrow range of pitches, which most folk melodies usually do. The texture is homophonic. This means that there's one main melody supported by chords. And out of all the textures in music, this is perhaps the easiest texture for our ears and brains to hear and process because it's rather uncomplicated. So I'll fast forward just a little bit and we can hear the call to the hunt and then the polka. Stop it. I'd encourage you to listen to the whole thing. It's really rather wonderful. Surely this music is beautiful even without the program or imagery attached to it. But by describing and comprehending what the composer does with the elements of music, we enjoy a deeper understanding and appreciation of that beauty. Even before the 19th century and the origin of program music, there was certainly program music. It just wasn't labeled. Music can't help but to communicate, and composers can't help but to rely on inspiration for their compositions. One of the most well-known examples of program music before the term itself even existed is Vivaldi's highly recognizable Four Seasons, a set of 4 violin concertos in which he drew upon Italian sonnets or poetry to musically express the seasons of the year. The iconic first movement of the Spring Concerto opens with a rhythmically energized pattern that features buoyant ascending leaps in the melody, the coming of spring. And then it continues. So you kind of feel the buoyancy that the new life in spring brings. This is quickly followed by sounds of birds played by the violins, chirping short little trills that eventually start to overlap each other in the upper register. The last movement of the Summer Concerto, which is the second concerto in the set, depicts from the corresponding sonnet the devastation that a summer hailstorm can bring to farmers. This final movement of the Summer Concerto opens with a very fast tempo, it's furious, a minor key, and the full string section playing large descending leaps in unison until they break into smaller groups and play descending scales at various times. The combination of all of these elements of music creates a drive and intensity to the sound, vividly depicting the unrelenting nature of a hailstorm that has the strength to beat powerfully on the earth. Program music works so effectively is that composers deliberately use the elements of music in creative and intentional ways in order to let the music say something specific. Composers also draw on the capacity of the human mind and the heart to comprehend what their music is meant to convey. They trust that the listeners will process the elements of music accordingly and will be able to comprehend that which is communicated in the music. Admittedly, we can enjoy program music, in this case the Smetana and the Vivaldi, with or without knowing the programs attached to them. They are well-crafted pieces of music and can stand on their own. However, knowing the program allows us to have a greater insight into the music itself, and perhaps to understand it on a deeper level, in the way that the composer intended. Not all music is program music, though. Does that mean that non-programmatic music lacks the ability to communicate? Of course not. The question answers itself. Music not only can communicate, but it does communicate. The human mind is quite capable of creating a narrative or a picture or an idea when listening to music, all based on sounds that we hear. This means that any particular piece of music must be composed and performed with quality and integrity, or there's nothing there worth communicating. John Mason Hodges is a contemporary conductor, lecturer, composer, and writer. You might be familiar with his name. He's considered a leading expert in aesthetics, classical education, and music. I would commend to you one of his newest lectures titled, "Can Music Express Meaning Without Words?" You can find it on YouTube, and it's pretty interesting. But in his written article titled, "Beauty in Music, Inspiration and Excellence," originally published in the Society for Classical Learning, he asserts that the way we should teach music is, quote, "By training our students' imaginations, starting with how to hear the elements of music," he continues. "The elements of music are rhythm, melody, harmony, form, texture, and timbre." Rhythm, melody, harmony, form, texture, and timbre, fused together to make a composition that can reflect the ideas, experiences, the very humanity of both composer and listener. The ability to discern, to distinguish, to perceive the language of music is the beginning of genuine taste about music. And taste is a facet of wisdom. So much is forming our souls. It really does matter what we listen to, end quote. In other words, if a piece of music doesn't have anything interesting or intentional or creative going on within the elements of music, it probably isn't worth listening to. And if a piece of music does have something interesting, intentional, or creative going on within the elements of music, it probably is worth paying attention to. Specifically labeled program music works great for this, but so does any piece of well-crafted music. When music is listened to actively with an informed imagination, rather than just letting music wash over us passively, which is okay from time to time. Sometimes it's good just to sit and relax and just let the music wash over you. But when music is listened to actively with an informed imagination, we train the mind and the heart to prefer music worth listening to. And by informed imagination, I don't mean that the imagination just runs wild. The imagination is informed by what's going on in the music, namely the elements of music. Now, for Built on the Rock, a tone poem for piano composed just last summer in 2023. I could play it for you right now without any explanatory comments. I think you'd enjoy it, and because it's well written, it does communicate something worth communicating. However, if you weren't familiar with the hymn, the text or the tune that it's based on, or if you didn't even know the title, you might listen to it and say something like, "Wow, that sounds like a movie soundtrack. It's very dramatic." Someone actually did tell me that a few weeks ago because we were in a rush and she wanted me to play something for her, and I did, and I didn't explain any of the programmatic elements beforehand. So to me, that's proof that music can be enjoyed without knowing the program. But it's better and deeper when you know what it's about. Exactly how does John Kosch, composer, use the elements of music, rhythm, melody, harmony, form, texture, and timbre to communicate the language of the hymn text? He indicates in his program notes that when he composed this, he specifically had stanzas 1, 2, and 5 in mind when he was composing. So let's sing these stanzas and refresh the text. And 1, 2, and 5. that John wrote is in the key of C minor, just like the hymn. More specifically, though, C Dorian, which is essentially a minor scale with the 6th degree raised a half step. So those of you who know your scales, you know that C minor has 3 flats. That's C minor, E flat, A flat, and E flat. The Dorian scale is basically a minor scale, but it has a chromatic inflection to it. The A natural is in there. And so it has just a little different flavor than a normal minor scale has, but it's still considered a minor scale. Why? Because the main chord is still minor. It's minor in C minor, and it's minor in C Dorian. It just has a unique sound to it. And I give you this information because it'll come into play in a little bit. Stanza 1. Built on the rock, the church shall stand even when steeples are falling. The tone poem begins with the idea of the falling steeples, depicted by a chromatic figuration of triplets in the upper register. The tempo is fast, the rhythm unrelenting, and the pitches are a series of dissonant intervals, namely minor sevenths, augmented fifths, minor seconds, etc. It's like a little bit like this. Kosch succeeds in making the opening sound confusing, full of angst, rather unpleasant, and with no sense of resolution or even a pause. But this is exactly what the text means. The world, because of sin, is constantly falling around us, constantly crashing in on us. There is chaos. There's nothing pleasant. There's no pause for us to catch our breath. We can't say, just wait a minute, let me catch my breath. It continually is there. However, the church with a capital C, which always refers to the people of God wherever they are found, is built on Him. He is our rock and our foundation. So amidst the chaos that you hear of falling steeples, the chorale tune enters in the low register, representing the stability we have as people of God. It is sturdy, it is confident, and it is bold. Hear that long drawn out chorale tune, and it enters in that bottom register, sure foundation. Now, he juxtaposes those two very disparate musical ideas into a very effective expounding of the main line of the hymn, and you'll hear that later. As we continue, when the first stanza of the hymn gets to the line, calling the young and the old to rest, the melody note on the word rest, you notice, is an E flat. E flat is the relative major of C minor. Relative keys are simply keys that share the same key signature. John chooses to prolong an E flat chord in the very low register to represent the idea of rest. But as the text continues with the next line, but above all, souls distressed, we hear the melody being harmonized with tritones, which is considered by many to be the most dissonant of intervals, which authentically portrays the idea of distress. The interval right between a perfect fifth, a perfect fourth and a perfect fifth, perfect fifth. The interval right between that tritone. It's a very dissonant interval. So what the composer does, feel the idea of a rest on E flat. Then the last line states, longing for rest everlasting, to me is the most heart-tugging line of the tone poem that John has written, precisely because of the way he depicts it. He continues a triplet pattern similar to the opening, but this time it's in the middle register and rather nondescript. This allows the melody, longing for rest everlasting, to be the main focus. But the melody is harmonized with sevenths. The interval of the seventh is only a step away from being a perfect octave. Generally, when composing music, it's a good idea to avoid consecutive sevenths, because sevenths are dissonant intervals, and they need to be resolved. Now, Good music is a combination of dissonances and consonances. Dissonances, unpleasing, unstable sounds, generally speaking. Consonances, stable or pleasing sounds. And we need both of them. We need to have an interaction between consonant chords and dissonant chords. If we listen to a piece of music that was all dissonant, we would turn it off after about 30 seconds because our ears just couldn't handle it. Conversely, if we have a piece that has only beautiful, stable chords, it's quite beautiful, and we might listen to it for a little bit longer, but I think it would start to lack a little interest after a while. So we need the interplay of consonant chords and dissonant chords. But typically, in an orderly fashion, following rules and conventions of theory, unless there's a good reason to break them. So the fact that John uses consecutive sevenths to harmonize this last melodic phrase of the stanza really does represent the idea of longing for rest everlasting, a musical longing for a consonant interval, and a spiritual longing for rest everlasting. So you can kind of hear that idea, as this stanza closes, stanza 1, when it comes to an end in music, we do hear a moment that resembles everlasting rest in a way that our finite minds can attempt to make sense of it. An octave and open fifth pattern that stays on the same pitch as C and G is repeated in such a way that seems to defy any sense of meter. So we hear this. And if you're not paying attention, you kind of lose count, and it's just kind of there. It's almost as if the music suspends time and calms the previous dissonances and unrest, giving us a tiny glimpse for our earthly minds of eternity. Then stanza 2 starts, surely in temples made with hands. The open fifth octave triplet configuration continues as stanza 1 ended. So this is continuing into stanza 2. While we hear the melody in open fifths below it. Open fifths, just by definition, they lack clarity. There's no third to inform us of the quality of chord, and open fifths lack stability. A chord with only 2 pitches can't rightly be considered a chord at all. Chords by definition must have 3 notes or more. And the texture of the music here is much thinner than before. So we've got this little movement going on at the top. We have that open fifth movement and setting of that first line of the hymn. All of this, the thinner texture, the instability of the open fifths, points to that idea of human craftsmanship. Even in the most adept hands, human craftsmanship will always be lesser than the craftsmanship of God. And I think it does a good job of communicating that musically. The stanza continues then, surely in temples made with hands, God the Most High is not dwelling. Here the rhythm does something it hasn't done before. It breaks into a polyrhythm. Polyrhythms are 2 or more rhythmic patterns going on at once. In this case, there are 2 melody notes against 3 sets of triplets. Mathematically, this isn't even. So you kind of hear that. It just doesn't fit right. And so the music gives a sense that something isn't quite right, or that God is not present. After this, the music bursts open, the range expands significantly, highlighting the fact that high above earth his temple stands. The text continues, he who dwells in heaven above. At this point, the very highest register of the piano is used. The text goes on, chooses to live with us in love, making our bodies his temple. The texture is much quieter, perhaps communicating something that is too lofty to comprehend. God dwelling in us. And the harmony during this part uses open-voiced 7th chords and chords with added pitches without going into a long explanation. These chords, they're not traditional, but they are pleasant sounding. and voiced in such a way that there's a sense of intrigue to the sound, which I think is a humble and effective attempt at trying to communicate such a profound mystery. So there's some color there to the chord. It just makes you consider it with a sense of awe. Finally, stanza 5. Grant then, O God, it will be done, that when the church bells are ringing, many in saving faith will come, where Christ his message is bringing. The most prominent feature in this section of the tone poem is John Kosch's ability to capture the essence of chiming church bells on the piano. Basically, he builds a wall of sound that is sustained with a damper pedal. But for some reason, this wall of sound doesn't strike me as overly dissonant. Anyone who has taken piano lessons knows that you typically change the pedal in such a way as to avoid unpleasant dissonances. You can't just put your foot on the pedal and leave it. In this brief section, though, specifically when we get to the words, where Christ his message is bringing, John does just that. He leaves the pedal down, and he uses all the notes of the C Dorian scale. We know that all scales are formed through distinct patterns of whole and half steps. And we know that the greatest dissonances within any scale are found in that half steps, like the crunchiest sound. Very crunchy. That's not a half step, that's a whole step, and it's a little bit more palatable. But we know that all scales have distinct patterns of whole and half steps. So if John uses all the notes of the scale, and they're all sustained, why does it seem to work here? Well, here's my theory. He makes an E flat the foundational note in the very lowest register. Just a reminder that E flat is the relative major, and so there's a brightness to this note that matches the concept or idea of church bells, I think. Because church bells, it's a positive sound. They are welcoming, and everyone hears them. They're for everyone, and I think the mood and the foundational note on the relative major kind of brightens the sound just a little bit. Had he made the foundational note in this particular section a C, when we're essentially in the key of C minor, the resulting sound and the resulting mood would have been less than pleasant and rather uninviting, perhaps even with a sense of skepticism. So one thing he does is he makes the bottom note a little brighter in E flat. Additionally, and because of this, hearing the E flat at the very bottom, E flat does feel like a temporary tonal center here. But since we're still using the same pitches as the C Dorian scale, we don't have a normal sounding E flat major scale. E flat major scale. I don't know what a major scale sounds like. But since we're using the same pitches as C Dorian, we know that C Dorian has an A natural. And so we're going to insert the A natural into this E flat scale. You the difference between that's major, and that's with the chromatic pitch from C Dorian brought in. Let's see where I am. Okay. So what we are left with is not an E flat major scale, but an E flat Lydian scale, which is essentially a major scale with a raised chord. Major, Lydian. They still have the same tonic chord. E flat, G, and E flat. The middle note of that chord, the G, is very important because it determines the quality of the chord, in this case major. If we look to either side of that middle note, that G, in the key of E flat Lydian, we notice that there are no half steps on either side, just whole steps. So on either side of the G, we have a whole step here, and we have a whole step there. So there are no half steps that are blurring the clarity of that major triad. It seems like such a small thing, but I believe that this makes the wall of sound that John creates, which utilizes all the pitches of the scale, palatable. We hear the melody in the top register, and above that, low sustained E flat. We hear the left hand playing ascending E flat Lydian scale, all the way up. To me, and I think lots of people would agree, order, voicing, and context does matter. And for this brief moment in the piece, centering the music around E flat Lydian rather than C Dorian, even though they both use the same pitches, makes the chiming and ringing effect truly powerful. After this wall of sound has had the chance to ring for a bit, the music drastically shifts to portray the final lines of the text. I know my own know me. You, not the world, my face shall see. My peace I leave with you. Amen. The texture is very sparse and quiet at this point, almost pulling the listener in as close as possible to receive a very special message, which it is. And I want to talk about the last word of the hymn text, amen. It's a word that is used to affirm a statement that was just given. Many hymns tack on an amen after the last stanza, but this amen is the end of the last stanza. Typically, amens after the last stanza are harmonized with a 4 chord going to a 1 chord. And this is known as the playbook cadence for those of you who are in theory. And it has a very distinctive sound. So, if we added an amen on the end of this, a 4 to a 1, and yes, John Kosch uses a picardy in the tone poem. A picardy, just really quickly, is when you end a minor piece with the major chord. So that's why I did that there. The end of each stanza of Built on the Rock, where the amen actually occurs, doesn't end with a 4 to a 1, like we'd expect an amen to sound like. It ends with the more traditional 5 to 1. So we can kind of hear the difference between those two cadences. So in order to resonate with our oral knowledge of the traditional amen, Kosch incorporates the 4 chords several times toward the very end of the tone poem. But they're kind of relatively hidden. If you're not really listening for it, you might not realize it. But the last 2 chords of this tone poem are an F chord to a C chord, which mimics the idea of an amen. The F chord, however, is not pure. It also includes the 4th pitch of that chord, of E flat. So it's got a little crunch to it. And rather than getting rid of that note that causes the crunch, because it doesn't really fit, he lets it ring. He lets that B flat ring through to the final chord, which is a C major chord, a chord that should sound perfect. That's a perfect chord. C major is quite lovely. But it's preceded by this, and then lets this pitch that doesn't fit hang over into that beautiful C major chord. And so what that does is it creates not a C triad, but a C7 chord. 7 chords by their very nature are unstable and require a resolution. You can't just play a 7th chord and walk away. You have to resolve it somehow. You have to do something. But the only resolution that this last chord of the tone poems allow is the decay, the natural decay of sound as it drifts away. And that's one of the things that the piano does really well. Sound just decays. To me, this is a very compelling end. It represents that we have a peace that passes all understanding, the C major chord. Even as we live in this world, E flat, moment of dissonance, and it's quiet. I'll have to maybe just lean in a little bit to hear it. It's there. But we have a piece throughout all of it. So I'll play the piece, the tone poem in its entirety right now. You can kind of follow the text if you like and try to hear some of the things that we discussed. But my encouragement for you is to be, for you, your students, your family, is to listen to music in such a way that you can start to describe what the elements of music are doing. Use music vocabulary to do that, and by doing so, you can enjoy a fuller understanding of what those sounds communicate, whether there is a program attached to it or not. Thank you. I do have the score if any of your, music minded and want to look at it. I'll just leave it here and otherwise thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you a question? Have you recorded this piece?
Yes.
Will it be released sometime soon?
Yes.
Just curious. Explain it.
It should be in video and audio form.
Released probably at the end of the summer.
And this is on-
YouTube, so it will be available. And we did a video audition of Dr. Grimpo playing it, so you can take it with you.
So now you'll know a little bit more about it. Even if you do listen to it.
Would we find that on the Concordia YouTube page, or where do we go to find that? YouTube's kind of vague sometimes.
Yeah, it is, type in exactly what you need. We'll probably share it on social media. We're working on getting our things uploaded to streaming platforms, but that's a long process, and we're not quite there yet. Email me.
Okay.
Email him. Kurt Von Hamlin, he's got a pretty good Facebook page.
Yeah. Find a way out. We've got to be.
But I love the piano so much more than organ. Sorry, organist. It's such a treasure when you have a music that's thoughtful.